All right. Well, good morning, folks. I hope everything is okay with everybody. I hope everyone is doing well, and your families as well. I know it's really difficult at this time to adjust to all the things that are going on. But my hope is then that by starting our class again here online, that we can try to get back to some semblance of normalcy. Continue to learn a little bit and try to do our best to learn the material. Okay. So what I'm going to do today then is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to kind of go over with you what we'll be doing as we transition to this web-based learning. Hopefully, what I've come up with will make the transition very easy and smooth. Try to make it as simple as possible while sticking to as much of the routine that we had in class as possible as well. And I think by doing it that way, the adjustment will be fairly smooth. So what you have in front of you right now is the schedule for the time that we have at home. That obviously is a pretty big difference. We don't have the rotating schedule, so we'll always be meeting at after lunch between 1:20 and 2:10. So make sure that you are on, ready to watch the video at 1:20. I'll explain what that is in just a moment. And then be done with the work that I have assigned for you by 2:10, and then we'll be done with our period. Okay, so that again is the first big change that we have for what we'll be doing the next at least the next couple weeks. What I'll try to do at the beginning of each lesson as well is I will uh, make the announcements like I normally do in class and let you know what's happening, what changes that we'll have to deal with, and so I'll let you know about that again, like I said, at the beginning of the period, at the beginning of the video. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do then is we're going to rely heavily on Google Classroom, which you have familiarity with, Edpuzzle, which you also know how to use, and then I will also use the Zoom app to communicate with you in a live manner. But the class then will be based on you watching the lecture that I have recorded for you, answering the questions in the class problem set, and then submitting that in along with a couple of problems that I will ask you to do at the end of the video. And that way, then you'll get credit for doing work during that day. I will also be available, and I'll point this out to you in a few slides. I will also be available to you for live tutorials in the afternoon, pretty much after seventh period. And so you're more than welcome to check in then and get your questions answered as well. But do understand I will be checking the classroom comments section. So if you have any questions while you're watching the video, make sure you ask through the comments or also email me. I will also be checking my email. So email me whatever question you have as you're watching the Edpuzzle video. Okay. I feel like I think this is the best way to go about doing this. If you can watch the Edpuzzle video, you can rewind to go over whatever section that you didn't quite understand. And then at that point, like I said, you can email me or make a comment on the Google comments section, and I will reply to your questions and I will answer your questions at that moment in time. So don't hesitate to email me. Don't hesitate to add comments in the Google Classroom as you're watching the video of the lesson that I've recorded for you. And I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Okay. All right. So as you watch the videos, then I will be working out the class problem, the problems from the class problem set like I normally do in class, but with a slight modification. What I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to work out the problem on your own first, and so it'll show up in the video. The video will pause, give you a moment to work out the problem. Okay? Then what you'll do is you'll type in your answer, you'll type in what you think was the right answer, start the video, and then I will work out the problem for you. What you'll need to do then is then you will go ahead and you will write down my solution under your work, and I'll show you a sample of that in just a moment. But that's one change that we're going to do as well. Okay. All right. So once the video is complete, then once you've watched the video completely, there will be some extra practice problems towards the end of the video that will be taken from your book, or ones that I've assigned for you. And you'll also include that as well. And you'll submit all of that work through Google Classroom to get credit for completing the lesson. And again, I'll explain this to you in just a moment when I give you show you an example. Okay? So make sure you understand then all that work has to be posted on Classroom and by the end of the period. By the end of the period, which for you folks is about 2:15. Okay? So make sure you have that submitted. And again, it'll be you'll submit all this work through Google Classroom, and this is on top of the homework that I'll assign for you. Okay, so the homework is still the same, and I'll point that out to you again as well. Okay, so make sure then you get that work done. Okay. So, for example, if this question pops up on the video and it asks you what time does first period start, what you would do then, the video would pause. What you do then is you would write, you'll get out a new piece of paper, you'll get out a separate sheet of paper, you'll write down your answer, and then you will and then you'll type in your answer in the video itself. Okay. So if you notice here, this is an example of what I did for you. Okay. And so I have my separate sheet of paper here. What I did in this paper then was I made sure that I had my name. This here. Okay. So if you notice here, there's my name. Make sure you write your note. Sorry. Sorry. Go back up. This doesn't seem to be working today. Okay, so make sure you write your name at the top of the paper, period, and your class. Make sure you indicate the day, today, and the date. Okay, and there I have listed then the class problem, the very first class problem, the problem that we did in the previous slide, and then I wrote down my answer. I wrote down my answer here. Okay, and then what I would do then is I would go ahead and I would enter in my answer onto Edpuzzle, and then the video then would show you the answer that I'll work out for you, and then on your paper then you'd write down the in-class solution. This is the solution from the video, and you'd write that down as well. You would write down the solution that was given to you in class. And so what you'll do then is this is the page that you'll turn in. So you'll do the other problems that we cover in class. And then what you'll do is at the bottom of this paper, you will go ahead then, and there'll be 1 or 2 problems that I'll ask you to do at the end of the video, and the problems will be taken from your book. You'll include those problems also on this paper, and then you'll submit that. You'll submit that through Google Classroom, and then you'll be done for our day. You'll be done for the day for our period. Okay. So I think that should be pretty straightforward. So make sure you write down. Don't forget to write down the solution that was given to you in class. Then you go on with the video and watch the rest of the video, work out the rest of the problems, and then go ahead and submit that. Okay. My hope is then so make sure you include all that and submit it in Google Classroom at the end of the period. Okay. So with these practice problems, like I said, I'll take them from the book. I will occasionally take them from other sources, but they will give you a chance to practice what we learned in class during the video, and then you'll work those out, submit them as well through Google Classroom. All right, so my hope then is what I'm going to do is if you have questions, like I said, don't hesitate to ask them. I'll be online. I'll be available through Google Classroom. I'll be available through my email, but I will also be available from 3:15 to 4:15, and 4:15 is the time that that I have set here. But we can go further if we go on past that time if we have to. But these are tutorials. These are your option to ask your questions, and these will be live. I'll be using the Zoom app in order to get your questions answered. And so there is the link that you'll use to get to our meeting page. So all you have to do is highlight that or click it on, and then it'll take you straight to our meeting page. And that's when we'll be able to interact with one another. Okay, so if you have any issues, if you can't get on using that link, again, make sure you email me and or email me and let me know, and I'll see what's going on. Okay, but hopefully I'll be able to see you this afternoon, a few of you this afternoon, 3:15 to 4:15, with whatever questions or concerns that you may have. Okay. All right, so that's it. That's how I think it's very simple. I think it's going to be pretty straightforward. I've tried to streamline the process in which we can interact with each other and conduct our class through this kind of really odd time. And so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to limit the video of my lecture to about 20-25 minutes. That way it gives you the rest of the time to work on the problems and submit the classwork in time before the period is done. Okay, so that's what I'm going to try to do. If I go over a little bit, then that's I won't go over that much more. But like I said, I'm going to definitely try to keep within the time frame in order to make sure then that you have the time to work and finish up the problems from the back from your book and submit everything on time. Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and let's get started. The exam, and I'm sorry, what we're going to do then is obviously we're going to have to postpone the exam for chapter 11. I'll let you know what we'll do with that. In terms of quizzes and exams, I'm going to hold off on exams for now. Quizzes, I'll let you know the format and how we'll carry out those quizzes. But again, exams, I think, considering the circumstances, I don't think it would be appropriate to give you an exam. But like I said, quizzes, I think that's workable, it's doable. And I'll let you know what we'll do with the quizzes, okay? All right, so we finished up with chapter 11, where we talked about chemical reactions, okay? And with the chemical reactions, make sure you understand what we were able to do is we were able to describe chemical reactions using chemical equations. You got to make sure you're still able to do that. But what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be transitioning to describing the equation, the chemical reactions in terms of amounts. Now, it's good that we were able to obtain a description of chemical reactions using the equations. And but the goal then is to be able to run these chemical equations, be able to carry them out, and make sure then that we're able to carry them out with the correct amounts as well. So remember, with the chemical equation, what we are given is a description, a symbolic description of the chemical reaction, but really there's no mention of how much we need to use. And I mean, we've talked about balancing chemical equations. The coefficients kind of give us an idea of the atoms that go into the reaction itself. But realistically, it's not possible to be able to run a chemical reaction at the atomic level. We can't pick out atoms and be able to run a reaction on the atomic level. So we have to be able to describe these, the compounds, the elements, in terms of quantities that we are able to measure out here on the macroscopic level. Okay? So what the focus of this chapter is going to be then is going to be on how we can determine the amounts of a particular substance, okay, that goes into a chemical reaction. So the amounts of the chemical substance that goes into chemical reaction is going to be fairly important. We want to make sure that we can maximize yields, which we will talk about in chapter 12. So chapter 12 deals with the chemical quantities that goes into a reaction. What we're going to learn here in chapter 10 is that we're going to learn how to calculate for the quantities of the individual substances. And so again, when we talk about these quantities here, we're talking about being able to describe how much of a particular substance we are dealing with. And so in dealing with how much here, we're going to be dealing with quantities that we should be able to measure out, or we should be able to count. So we are basically dealing with counted quantities and counted quantities, and also volumes and masses. So that's what we're going to be dealing with in this chapter. And at the end of the chapter, then what we'll also be learning how to calculate then for this percent composition. From that percent composition, we'll be able to actually obtain the empirical and the actual formulas for these substances that we'll be dealing with. And so understand this, there's basically, if you want to think about it, 5 different calculations that we'll be doing in this chapter. The math itself is not that difficult, folks. If you remember the conversions that we did back in the chapter 3 in the first semester, if you learned it then, if you learned how to do conversions then, this chapter is going to be fairly straightforward for you. And so what I'll do is we'll start out in this chapter by talking about conversions. We'll talk about conversions. And furthermore, I will be introducing to you a new unit that we will be using in order to deal with these very, very small particles and scale them up onto the macroscopic level. Okay, so I'll introduce this unit called the mole to you, and we'll talk about what it is. We'll also talk about how we can relate that unit of mole to masses of elements and compounds as well. Okay. All right. So when we measure stuff, the stuff in chemistry, then we refer to as matter. When we measure this stuff, understand this: we have then a couple ways that we can do it. We can describe the amount of stuff that we have in terms of how much mass it has. We drop it on a scale. We can measure out the mass, and we can get a number there. We get a number, and we can determine then from that number how big or how small that stuff is. Okay, so if you have apples, for example, you want to find out how much mass 5 apples are together. You can drop those 5 apples on a scale, get a measurement. We have a number that's associated with those 5 apples. The mass there describes the mass of the 5 apples, which is going to be different than from the mass of 1 apple, for example, and it will be different from the mass of 5 grapes. And so we can describe then the apples not only in terms of what color it is, how it tastes, how it feels, but we can also describe it in terms of how much we have. We can describe the mass of it as well. And so with that said, that's a numerical description of those apples rather than a verbal or a written description of those apples. And that's what we're doing when we measure the mass. Okay? We can also describe how much space an object has. An object also occupies space. We learned back in chapter 2 that all forms of matter have mass and they also occupy space. So going back to the example of the 5 apples, those 5 apples occupy also a certain amount of space. You drop those 5 apples in a bag, they're gonna fill up that bag to a certain point. That will be different from the 5 grapes or 5 watermelons. Okay? So each one of those objects occupies a certain amount of space, and so we can measure that. We can also measure the volume. We can do water displacement. We can measure the volume that those 5 apples take up, and so we can use that number to describe the apples as well. Okay? And so the last way, though, that we can describe, so there's a number there. I'm sorry, going back to volume. There's a number there that we can use to describe the volume of those apples. Okay? All right. And there's a third way. There's a third way that we can also describe these apples. And if you have 5 apples, okay, the number itself, 5, there indicates the counted quantities, counted number of apples that we have, which would be different than if we had 10 apples. 10 apples are different from 5 apples. So that descriptor 5, that number 5, doesn't describe the mass, doesn't describe the volume, but it describes for us then the amount, the number that we have, the actual number that we have. Okay. And so with that said then, with mass, we have units that also can be used to describe mass and then volume as well. And so with mass and volume, we have not only a number that describes the amount of that we have, but also a unit that describes what is being measured, what's being looked at. Okay. And so make sure you keep that in mind as well. This is, I think, is somewhat review what we did back in chapter 3. Make sure you also remember then that we had the prefixes that we used back in chapter 3. Make sure you look at those, but there were 3 that I asked you to make sure you had memorized. So make sure you know what the milli, the centi, and the kilo refer to. And if you don't remember that, please make sure you go back and you review that for this chapter. Okay. All right. So with that said, then we had units that we used to describe then mass, kilograms, grams, and other types of mass units. Okay, we had units that we can use to describe volume, liter, milliliter, and so forth. So those are units that we can use to describe mass and volume, respectively. There are actually units that we can use to describe counted quantities as well. That is, the certain number of objects